The chapel was quiet, in the way expensive places often are soft music-polished wood guests speaking in careful whispers. Isaiah Caldwell stood at the altar, relaxed, confident, shaking hands with people who admired him. Someone asked gently about his past marriage. Isaiah smiled with practiced patience. "My ex-wife, Marina. She wasn't well," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound compassionate. The divorce was necessary. A few guests nodded sympathetically. What none of them knew was that Isaiah's own voice, recorded years earlier, calm and calculating, was already waiting in the wrong hands. And before the night of this wedding ended, that voice would tell a very different story. If you believe that truth eventually finds its way to the surface, stay with this story. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. I always like seeing how far these stories travel. If stories about quiet strength, justice, and the long road to truth matter to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Now, the real story begins. After the divorce, Isaiah Caldwell did not simply move on with his life. He organized the story. Not with formal statements or dramatic accusations, nothing so obvious. Isaiah preferred quieter methods, the kind that spread naturally through conversation. A comment here, a concerned sigh there. A sentence delivered with just enough restraint to feel sincere. "My ex-wife had a difficult time," he would say. Or sometimes, if the room felt sympathetic enough, Marina struggled more than people realized. He never raised his voice. He never sounded bitter. That was part of the effectiveness. In the months after the divorce, those sentences traveled across dinner tables, golf courses, charity events, and office hallways. They moved through circles that Isaiah knew well: business associates, neighborhood couples, professional acquaintances who had once known both of them. It was never presented as gossip. It was concern, and concern, when delivered carefully, is one of the most persuasive forms of narrative. Marina Caldwell learned this slowly. At first, the changes around her were subtle. A friend postponed lunch. Another canceled coffee with an apology that felt slightly rehearsed. A couple she and Isaiah had once vacationed with together stopped responding to messages entirely. No one confronted her. No one accused her. But people looked at her differently. They spoke more gently. They asked questions in the cautious tone people use when they suspect fragile ground beneath their feet. "How are you doing these days? You've been through a lot." Isaiah said it was a really hard situation. Marina always answered the same way. "I'm doing fine." She said it calmly, without defensiveness. And in most cases, that was the end of the conversation. But people often left those exchanges looking unconvinced. Silence, unfortunately, can resemble guilt when someone else has already written the explanation. Marina understood this. She had understood it for a long time. Marina Caldwell was not a dramatic person. She had spent most of her career as an operations manager for a mid-sized logistics firm in Northern Virginia, a job that rewarded precision more than personality. Her work involved spreadsheets, compliance reviews, and schedules that ran down to 15-minute increments. She was comfortable with details: numbers, timestamps, written records. Facts rarely raised their voices, but they had a habit of remaining consistent. During the final year of her marriage, Marina had begun relying on those habits more than ever. Not because she planned a confrontation, because clarity had become necessary. Isaiah Caldwell had always been impressive in public. Tall, articulate, confident, without appearing arrogant. He worked in commercial real estate development, a field where charm and persuasion often determined outcomes long before contracts were signed. People liked him quickly. They trusted him easily. And Isaiah knew exactly how to maintain that impression. In public settings, he was attentive, considerate, occasionally self-deprecating in a way that made people feel comfortable around him. In private settings, the tone shifted, never dramatically, never in a way that would alarm an outsider, but enough that Marina began noticing the pattern. Conversations that happened one way in the moment would later be described differently. A disagreement would become an overreaction. A simple question about finances might later be recalled as an emotional accusation. At first, Marina assumed it was ordinary miscommunication. Marriages were complicated. People remembered events differently. But over time, the pattern became difficult to ignore. Isaiah's version of events always traveled faster than the original moment. By the time a story reached other people, it had already changed shape. Not drastically, just enough. For example, there had been an evening 2 years before the divorce when Marina asked Isaiah about a series of unfamiliar transfers she had noticed in their shared checking account. They were small, $300 here, $400 there, but they appeared regularly over several weeks. She had asked about them while standing in the kitchen, holding her phone. Isaiah glanced at the screen and shrugged. Business reimbursements, he said. That seemed reasonable. But 2 days later, during dinner with another couple, the same conversation resurfaced in a different form. Isaiah laughed lightly as he described it. Marina thought I was secretly moving money around, he told them. I guess the world of real estate makes people suspicious. The comment was delivered playfully. Everyone laughed. Marina smiled politely. But the moment stayed with her. Not because the statement was entirely false, because it had changed the tone of the original question. By the time the story reached other ears, Marina was no longer asking a practical question. She was being portrayed as anxious, suspicious, perhaps even paranoid. That evening, after they returned home, Marina opened her laptop and began saving a few things. Nothing dramatic, just copies of emails related to shared finances, a few screenshots of transaction records, calendar entries that marked when certain conversations had happened. She stored them in a folder with a neutral name, Operations Archive. The habit continued quietly. When Isaiah forwarded financial documents, she saved them. When conversations referenced specific numbers or dates, she wrote them down in a small notebook she kept in her desk drawer. Not as evidence, at least not yet, more as reassurance. Documentation created stability in situations where memory felt unreliable. Meanwhile, Isaiah's public narrative continued spreading. By the time the divorce was finalized, most people in their shared social circle believed a simplified version of events. Isaiah had tried. Marina had struggled. The marriage had become unsustainable. It was an explanation that required no villains, which made it easy to accept. Marina never attempted to correct it, not once. She understood something that many people did not. Once a narrative had settled comfortably in the minds of others, arguing against it rarely changed anything. People did not abandon familiar explanations easily. They defended them. So Marina focused on other things. Her work. Her small townhouse on the edge of Alexandria. Morning walks that took her along quiet streets before the city fully woke up. She reorganized her finances, adjusted to living alone, and gradually built a routine that felt steady again. If people whispered about her mental state, she never addressed it. If someone asked careful questions, she answered them simply. And then she returned to the life she was rebuilding. What no one around her realized, not Isaiah, not the acquaintances who had accepted his story, was that Marina had never stopped paying attention. She had not argued. She had not protested. But she had kept everything. Emails, receipts, financial summaries, archived backups from devices that had once belonged to both of them. Quietly, methodically, the way someone trained in operations might maintain a record of a complex project. Most of those files meant nothing on their own. A receipt here, a message there. But together, they formed a pattern. And patterns, when studied carefully enough, often reveal intentions that casual observers miss. For now, the pattern remained incomplete. Marina understood that. She did not know exactly what it would eventually prove, but she also knew something else. Stories built on sympathy can last for years, until the wrong document appears or the wrong voice is heard. And somewhere in Marina Caldwell's quiet townhouse, in a folder that no one else had ever opened, the first pieces of that future moment were already waiting. Long before the divorce, before the quiet distance that followed it, Marina Caldwell had once believed her marriage to Isaiah was built on something solid, From the outside, it certainly appeared that way. They met at a fundraising dinner in Arlington, one of those polished events where young professionals gathered beneath soft lighting and carefully arranged floral centerpieces. Isaiah had been speaking with a group near the bar when someone introduced them. Marina remembered noticing how easily he moved through conversations. Isaiah had a particular way of listening. He tilted his head slightly, maintained eye contact, and responded with thoughtful questions that made people feel as though they had said something important. It was a talent. Not everyone possessed it. Within 20 minutes, Marina had learned about Isaiah's work in commercial real estate development, his interest in local architecture, and his belief that cities should be built around people rather than traffic. Within the same 20 minutes, Isaiah had learned far more about her. Her work in operations management, her preference for organized systems, her habit of planning 3 steps ahead. He smiled when she described it. That's rare, he told her. Most people avoid details. They overwhelm them. Marina laughed softly. Details are usually the only honest part of a situation, she said. Isaiah seemed genuinely impressed. Looking back, the narrator understands something Marina did not yet know. Isaiah admired her precision not because he shared it, but because he understood how easily precision could later be reframed. They began dating soon after. The early months of their relationship felt balanced. Isaiah was attentive, curious about Marina's work, enthusiastic about building a future together. Friends described them as complementary, his charisma paired with her steadiness. He introduced her proudly at gatherings. "This is Marina," he would say, one arm lightly around her shoulders. "The most organized person I know." People smiled. The statement sounded affectionate. And at the time it was. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony outside Charlottesville, surrounded by family and a handful of close friends. The photographs from that day showed sunlight filtering through oak trees, white chairs arranged in careful rows, and Isaiah standing beside Marina with the same confident smile that had first drawn her attention. For a while, the marriage seemed to function the way successful marriages often do. They worked. They hosted dinners. They planned occasional trips. Isaiah's career expanded steadily as he moved into larger development projects. And Marina continued building her reputation as someone who could stabilize complicated operational systems. But sometime during the 3rd year of the marriage, small changes began appearing. Not dramatic ones, subtle shifts in tone. Isaiah's recollections of conversations began drifting slightly away from what Marina remembered. At first, she assumed it was ordinary forgetfulness. People misremembered details all the time. But the adjustments always seemed to tilt in the same direction. One evening, they attended a neighborhood dinner hosted by another couple down the street. During the meal, the conversation turned to budgeting for home renovations. Marina mentioned that she preferred tracking expenses carefully before starting any project. Isaiah laughed lightly. "Marina loves spreadsheets," he told the table. "If she had her way, we'd track the cost of every paper towel." Everyone chuckled. Marina smiled too, though she had never actually said anything like that. Later that night, after they returned home, she mentioned it casually. "I don't think I'm that obsessive about paper towels." Isaiah shrugged as he loosened his tie. It was a joke, he said. The explanation was reasonable. Still, something about the moment lingered. Over time, those moments multiplied. Isaiah would retell events slightly differently than Marina remembered. Arguments that began as calm discussions might later be described as emotional confrontations. Questions about finances sometimes reappeared in conversation as accusations. The differences were small enough that Marina rarely challenged them. And when she did, Isaiah always responded calmly. "I think you're remembering it differently," he would say. Not dismissive, just certain. That certainty gradually created a quiet imbalance. Marina began noticing that other people were responding not to the original events, but to Isaiah's descriptions of them. A dinner conversation might lead to a friend later asking her if she was feeling stressed. A simple disagreement about travel plans might somehow become evidence that she had been overwhelmed recently. None of it was dramatic, which made it harder to address, because dramatic behavior attracts attention. Subtle adjustments pass easily through social spaces without resistance. One particular evening stayed with Marina long after it happened. It occurred late in the 4th year of their marriage. Isaiah had returned home later than expected from a meeting with investors. Marina was already sitting at the dining table reviewing some monthly budget summaries when he walked in. "You're still working?" he asked, setting his briefcase down. "Just finishing something," she replied. Isaiah glanced at the laptop screen and frowned slightly. "You look tense." "I'm not tense," Marina said. "Just focused." He watched her for a moment. "You've been doing that a lot lately. Doing what, worrying about things that aren't problems yet?" The statement was delivered gently, almost kindly. But Marina hadn't realized she was worrying. She was simply reviewing numbers. Still, the comment settled into the room as though it had identified something real. Over the next few days, Isaiah mentioned similar observations in passing. "You've seemed stressed lately. I'm concerned about how much pressure you're putting on yourself. If work is becoming too much, you should say something." Marina began noticing that those comments appeared in conversations with other people as well. At a weekend gathering with friends, Isaiah mentioned that Marina had been dealing with a lot of stress. He said it with visible concern, which made everyone sympathetic. No one questioned it. Marina found herself reassuring people that she felt fine. Each reassurance seemed to reinforce the idea that reassurance was necessary. That was the moment she began writing things down. Not because she believed Isaiah was intentionally distorting events, at least not yet, but because she wanted to understand the pattern clearly. She purchased a small black notebook from a stationery store near her office and placed it inside her desk drawer. Inside it, she began recording simple entries. Dates, brief descriptions of conversations, exact wording when she could remember it. Nothing emotional, just information. If Isaiah mentioned a concern about her stress levels, she wrote down when it happened. If a conversation about finances occurred, she recorded the numbers involved. Over time, the notebook filled with short factual notes. At first, the habit felt unnecessary. But as months passed, Marina noticed something interesting. The notes began aligning with the digital records she'd quietly saved: emails, transaction histories, calendar reminders. Individually, none of the entries meant much. Together, they formed a timeline. And timelines have a way of revealing direction. Meanwhile, Isaiah appeared unaware of any change. His public reputation remained intact. Friends continued describing him as thoughtful and patient. If anything, the narrative about Marina's supposed stress gradually became part of the background understanding people carried about their marriage. No one accused her directly. But when disagreements surfaced in social settings, people often looked at Isaiah first, waiting for his interpretation. And Isaiah always provided one. Looking back, the narrator understands that Isaiah believed he was managing a story. He believed he was protecting his image while gently preparing the world for a future explanation if the marriage eventually failed. What he did not realize was that Marina had already begun documenting the structure of that story. Quietly, carefully, without announcing it to anyone. And in time, those quiet notes would become far more important than Isaiah had ever imagined. By the 5th year of the marriage, the changes between Marina and Isaiah Caldwell had become quiet but unmistakable. Not louder, not more dramatic, just more structured. Isolation, when it happens, carefully rarely announces itself. It arrives through adjustments so small that each one feels reasonable on its own. A postponed dinner, a conversation explained differently, a concern shared in confidence. Individually, none of these moments seemed significant. But over time, they began to reshape the space around Marina without anyone realizing it. Isaiah never told people to avoid her. He never criticized her openly. Instead, he framed situations in ways that made distance appear compassionate. At a small neighborhood barbecue one summer evening, the pattern appeared again. A group of couples stood near the patio while someone grilled burgers nearby. The conversation drifted through harmless topics, weekend plans, work projects, a new restaurant opening downtown. At some point, Marina mentioned she had taken on a particularly complicated operational audit at work. "It's manageable," she said. "Just a lot of moving parts." Isaiah smiled politely beside her. "She tends to take on too much," he said to the group. "I keep telling her she doesn't have to solve every problem personally." The comment sounded supportive. A few people nodded sympathetically. Later that evening, one of the other women pulled Marina aside near the kitchen doorway. "Are you doing okay?" she asked gently. Marina blinked. "Of course, I just meant Isaiah mentioned work has been stressful for you." Marina paused for a moment before answering. "It's busy," she said, "but it's normal." The woman smiled, relieved. "That's good. He just seemed worried." Marina thanked her for asking. But the moment lingered. Because she had not told Isaiah, she felt overwhelmed. And yet somehow the idea had already begun circulating. It happened often enough that Marina began noticing the mechanics of it. Isaiah rarely described her as unstable or emotional. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he positioned himself as concerned. Concern suggested patience. Concern suggested kindness. And kindness made his interpretation feel trustworthy. The result was subtle, but powerful. If Marina ever disagreed with him in public, people would naturally assume that the disagreement might be connected to the stress he had quietly mentioned before. Even calm reactions could be interpreted differently once that idea had been introduced. The notebook in Marina's desk drawer began filling more quickly. She wrote down each instance with careful neutrality. June 12th, that's barbecue conversation. Isaiah mentioned work stress. June 18th, dinner with Mark and Lindsay. Isaiah repeated concern about workload. June 24th, phone call with Hannah, asked if everything was okay. The entries were short, no commentary, just timestamps. Marina was not trying to build a case against her husband. At least that was not how she described it to herself. She simply wanted clarity. Patterns are easier to see when written down. Meanwhile, Isaiah's professional life continued moving forward smoothly. He had recently joined a development firm that specialized in mixed-use commercial projects throughout Northern Virginia and Maryland. The position placed him in contact with investors, city planners, and construction teams on a regular basis. Charisma mattered in that environment. Isaiah possessed it naturally. People trusted him quickly. At networking events, he moved easily from one conversation to another, remembering names, asking about family members, following up on small details others might forget. Those interactions reinforced the image he had quietly built at home. Patient, responsible, concerned about his wife's well-being. If someone noticed tension between Marina and Isaiah, the explanation already existed. She had been under pressure lately. Nothing serious, just stress. That explanation traveled through social spaces like background music, barely noticed, but always present. Marina rarely challenged it. There were moments when she considered correcting someone. But each time she imagined the conversation, she saw how it would sound. Isaiah had expressed concern. If she denied it too strongly, she might appear defensive. If she dismissed it casually, people might interpret that as avoidance. The narrative had been constructed carefully enough that arguing against it would only strengthen it. So Marina remained quiet. Silence, however, did not mean inattention. Her observation became sharper over time. One evening in early autumn, Marina sat at the dining table reviewing a set of monthly account statements. The numbers were ordinary utilities, mortgage payments, grocery expenses, but one detail caught her attention. A series of small transfers had appeared again. $300, $450, $280. The payments were labeled as reimbursements connected to Isaiah's work expenses. Marina did not immediately question them. Business reimbursements happened frequently in Isaiah's line of work. Still, she opened the banking application and scrolled through several previous months. The pattern extended further back than she expected. Dozens of transfers, always similar amounts, always categorized in ways that suggested temporary expenses. Marina leaned back in her chair thinking. When Isaiah arrived home later that night, she asked about them. Those small transfers labeled reimbursements, she said, turning the laptop screen toward him. Isaiah glanced briefly at the numbers. Oh, those. Yes, they're just temporary expenses that get paid back through the project accounts, he explained. Which project? Several. Depends on the month. The answer sounded reasonable. Marina nodded slowly. Okay. Isaiah studied her expression. You're not worried about it, are you? No, she said calmly. I was just organizing the records. He smiled, relieved. That's why I married you, he joked. You keep everything organized. The conversation ended there. But later that evening, after Isaiah had gone to bed, Marina opened her laptop again. She downloaded the statements from the previous year, saved them in the same neutral folder where she had stored other financial documents. Then she wrote a short note in her notebook. October 3rd, asked about reimbursement transfers, explanation unclear. Again, no commentary, just information. Marina did not yet know whether the transfers meant anything unusual. But documentation required consistency. If the numbers eventually proved irrelevant, the records would simply remain unused. If they proved meaningful, the timeline would already exist. The months continued passing. The quiet distance between Marina and Isaiah grew larger. Not through arguments, through atmosphere. They functioned more like coordinated roommates than partners sharing a home, exchanging polite conversation, attending social events when necessary. From the outside, the arrangement still appeared stable. Inside, the marriage had become a structure of careful silence. What neither of them openly acknowledged was that both had begun preparing for the possibility of its end. Isaiah prepared by shaping how others perceived the relationship. Marina prepared by recording what actually happened within it. Two different strategies, two different understandings of truth. And as winter approached that year, the quiet architecture of their separation was already being built piece by piece, entry by entry, long before either of them would formally speak the word divorce. By the time Marina Caldwell began considering divorce seriously, the marriage had already settled into a quiet stalemate. There were no dramatic arguments, no broken furniture, no slammed doors. If someone had visited the Caldwell house on an ordinary evening, they might have seen two adults living peacefully under the same roof. Dinner prepared, dishes washed, television murmuring softly in the background. But calm on the surface does not always mean stability beneath it. Sometimes it simply means both people have stopped expecting change. Marina recognized this before Isaiah did. She noticed it in the way their conversations had shortened over the years, reduced to logistical exchanges about schedules, errands, and upcoming social events. The emotional core of their marriage, the sense that two people were building something together, had gradually disappeared. In its place remained structure, routine, politeness. It was during one particularly quiet winter evening that Marina first allowed herself to imagine leaving. She had been reviewing financial records again, organizing documents for tax preparation. The habit had become almost automatic by then. Download statements, categorize expenses, update spreadsheets. While doing so, she noticed something she had overlooked before. The reimbursement transfers were still appearing, not frequently enough to attract immediate suspicion, but regularly enough to form a pattern. More interesting was their timing. Several of the transfers had occurred shortly before the couple met with their financial advisor earlier that year. During that meeting, Isaiah had confidently described their shared accounts, investments, and savings structure. At the time, everything had sounded reasonable. But now Marina noticed that some of the transfers seemed to move money out of their primary joint account shortly before those financial summaries were presented. Then weeks later, similar amounts would appear again. The sums were never large. $300, $500, occasionally $800. small enough that most people would never question them. But Marina had spent years working in operations management. Patterns were difficult for her to ignore. That evening, she opened a new spreadsheet. Not because she believed Isaiah was doing anything improper, but because data deserved organization. She listed each transfer by date amount and description. Then she compared those dates with other financial events, credit card payments, investment contributions, mortgage withdrawals. After an hour of quiet work, the numbers formed a timeline. Marina stared at the screen for a long moment. The pattern was not dramatic, but it was deliberate, which raised a question she had not previously asked herself. Why would Isaiah move small amounts of money repeatedly through reimbursements instead of using direct transfers or expense accounts? There could be reasonable explanations. Business travel, temporary expenses, project reimbursements processed through different channels. Still, the habit of documentation guided her next decision. She saved the spreadsheet. Then she copied the bank statements connected to those transfers into the same archive folder she had maintained for years. She did not mention it to Isaiah again. By that time, their marriage had reached a stage where certain questions no longer felt productive. Instead, Marina began speaking quietly with a divorce attorney recommended by a colleague at work. His name was Daniel Harper. Daniel's office occupied the 6th floor of a modest building in downtown Alexandria. The waiting room smelled faintly of paper and coffee the way law offices often do. Marina arrived for their first meeting on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a slim folder of documents. Daniel greeted her with professional warmth and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. So he said gently, "Tell me what's been happening." Marina explained the situation calmly. She described the gradual changes in her marriage. The narrative Isaiah had begun spreading among friends. The financial patterns she had noticed. She spoke without anger, just clarity. Daniel listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. When she finished, he leaned back slightly. "First," he said, "I want to say something important. None of what you've described is unusual in divorce cases." Marina nodded. "That's what I assumed." However, Daniel continued tapping his pen against the notebook. Proving intent is another matter entirely. He reviewed the financial spreadsheet she had created. "These transfers," he said thoughtfully, "they're interesting, but by themselves they don't necessarily indicate wrongdoing." "I understand. Unless we can demonstrate concealment during financial disclosures, they may simply be categorized as business reimbursements." Marina had expected this answer. "I'm not looking for revenge," she said. "I just want the separation to be accurate." Daniel studied her for a moment, as though measuring the sincerity of the statement. "Accuracy is a good goal," he replied. Over the next several weeks, the divorce process began quietly. Isaiah did not contest the idea when Marina mentioned it. In fact, his response surprised her. "If that's what you want," he said one evening, standing near the kitchen counter, "I think it's probably the healthiest option for both of us." The statement sounded almost relieved. Looking back, the narrator understands why. Isaiah had already spent months preparing the social explanation for the marriage's failure. If the divorce happened calmly, the story he had introduced would appear confirmed. Marina had struggled. He had tried. Now both of them were moving forward peacefully. The legal process unfolded efficiently. Daniel Harper handled the paperwork with methodical professionalism. Financial disclosures were exchanged. Property divisions were discussed. Isaiah remained cooperative. He responded to requests quickly. He agreed to reasonable settlements. From a legal perspective, the case appeared straightforward. At one point, Daniel mentioned this during a phone call. "Your husband is making this easier than many clients experience," he said. "I've noticed," Marina replied. But even as the process moved smoothly, something continued troubling her. Several financial categories in the disclosure documents seemed oddly simplified. Certain accounts listed balances lower than the patterns she had observed earlier. The reimbursement transfers were still present, but their cumulative effect had been minimized through classification. Marina reviewed the documents carefully. Then she scheduled another meeting with Daniel. They sat together in his office again, examining the paperwork. "I can't prove anything," Marina said quietly, "but the numbers feel incomplete." Daniel folded his hands. "That may be true," he said, "but without stronger evidence, challenging the disclosures could extend this case significantly." How significantly? Possibly a year, maybe more. Marina considered that for a long moment. A year meant continued legal expenses, continued emotional tension, continued connection to a marriage she'd already accepted was ending. Finally, Zadi decided she closed the folder. "I don't want to spend another year arguing," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. "That's a reasonable decision." So the divorce settlement proceeded without dramatic conflict. Marina retained her townhouse in Alexandria and a portion of their joint savings. Isaiah kept several investment accounts connected to his real estate projects. Both parties signed the final documents on a quiet afternoon in early spring. There were no raised voices, no courtroom confrontations, just signatures on paper. When Marina stepped outside the courthouse that day, the air carried the faint warmth of early April. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing slowly. Legally, the marriage had ended. Emotionally, it had ended much earlier. Still, as she walked toward her car, Marina carried with her the quiet awareness that something about the financial story remained unfinished. She had chosen peace over prolonged investigation. For now. But the records she had saved, the spreadsheets, the statements, the archived emails remained stored safely in the folders she had maintained for years. And sometimes unfinished patterns have a way of resurfacing when least expected, especially when the person who noticed them never stopped paying attention. For several months after the divorce, Marina Caldwell allowed her life to become intentionally quiet. There was relief in the stillness. Not the dramatic relief people sometimes imagine. After the end of a marriage, no celebratory freedom, no sudden reinvention. Instead, there was the steady rhythm of ordinary days, returning to their natural shape. Marina woke early, often before sunrise. She had always preferred the quiet hour before the city fully stirred. On most mornings, she walked through the same neighborhood streets near her townhouse. In Alexandria, passing small brick homes, trimmed hedges, and the occasional dog walker who nodded politely without asking questions. Afterward, she returned home, brewed coffee, and reviewed her schedule for the day. Work remained steady. The logistics firm where she served as an operations manager had recently expanded its contracts with several regional shipping partners, which meant new compliance systems needed to be built and monitored. The work suited her. It required attention to detail, patience, and consistency, qualities Marina possessed in abundance. Her colleagues respected her not because she spoke loudly, but because the system she created rarely failed. If something went wrong, Marina was usually the first to notice. In the months after the divorce, she focused on that stability. She reorganized her finances, adjusted household expenses to reflect living alone, and gradually removed the last shared remnants of her marriage from daily routines. Isaiah's coffee mug disappeared from the kitchen cabinet. The spare key he once carried was removed from the hallway drawer. Even the digital accounts they had once shared, streaming services, delivery subscriptions, were quietly transferred or canceled. None of it felt dramatic, just orderly. Meanwhile, Isaiah Caldwell's life moved in a very different direction. If Marina's post-divorce world grew smaller and calmer, Isaiah's appeared to expand. Within weeks of the final paperwork being signed, he began appearing more frequently in social circles they had once shared. Charity events, networking dinners, small weekend gatherings among neighborhood couples. And at those gatherings, Isaiah's version of the story settled into place with surprising ease. He spoke about the divorce rarely and carefully. When someone asked, he would pause slightly before answering, as though choosing his words with compassion. It was difficult, he might say. Marina had been struggling for a while. The phrasing sounded generous, concerned. And because the divorce itself had happened without conflict, people rarely questioned the explanation. To many of them, the situation now seemed clear. Isaiah had endured a challenging marriage. Now he was beginning a new chapter. That chapter began sooner than most people expected. It happened at a charity gala held at a restored hotel near downtown Washington, an event supporting educational scholarships for underfunded public schools. The ballroom glittered with glass chandeliers and carefully arranged tables. Isaiah attended alone that evening. At least, he arrived alone. Near the end of the event, however, he was seen speaking with a woman near the entrance hallway, a woman many people had not noticed earlier. Her name was Savannah Whitaker. Savannah came from a family well known in several professional circles throughout Northern Virginia. Her father, Robert Whitaker, had spent 3 decades working in regional infrastructure consulting, while Savannah herself directed fundraising efforts for a nonprofit organization focused on youth literacy programs. She was intelligent, composed, and widely liked by the people who knew her. That evening, someone introduced her to Isaiah during a conversation about urban development and nonprofit partnerships. Their discussion lasted nearly 20 minutes. Later, several guests would remember how easily the two of them seemed to connect. Isaiah's charm paired naturally with Savannah's calm professionalism. Both spoke confidently, listened attentively, and appeared comfortable in social environments where many others struggled. Within a few weeks, the two began seeing each other regularly. At first, their relationship developed quietly. Dinner at small restaurants, walks along the waterfront in Old Town, occasional events connected to Savannah's nonprofit work. But Isaiah did not remain private about the relationship for long. He had always preferred public momentum. By the 3rd month, Savannah was appearing beside him at larger gatherings, fundraisers, real estate networking receptions, neighborhood parties. People welcomed her quickly. She was warm, articulate, and gracious in conversation. And because Isaiah had already framed his previous marriage as something painful but resolved his new relationship, felt like a hopeful development. Friends began commenting on how happy he seemed. Isaiah accepted those comments modestly. "It's still new," he would say with a thoughtful smile. "But yes, things are good." Meanwhile, Marina learned about the relationship the way many people now learn such news, through photographs. One evening after work, she sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through social media updates, when a familiar name appeared in her feed. Isaiah Caldwell. The photograph showed him standing beside Savannah at a charity dinner, both of them dressed formally beneath soft lighting. The caption read, "A wonderful evening supporting literacy programs with great people." Marina studied the image for several seconds. Savannah stood slightly angled toward Isaiah, smiling comfortably. Isaiah's hand rested lightly against Savannah's back. The body language suggested familiarity. Marina set the phone down on the table. She did not feel anger, nor jealousy, just recognition. Isaiah had always been someone who moved forward quickly once a narrative was established. The story he had told about his marriage made it easy for others to see this new relationship as part of his recovery. The following months confirmed that impression. Isaiah and Savannah became a regular presence in the same social circles that had once included Marina. Some of those acquaintances felt awkward about the overlap. Others simply adjusted. Time has a way of smoothing transitions when no one speaks directly about them. Eventually, the announcement arrived. It appeared first through the word of mouth, then through photographs. Isaiah Caldwell and Savannah Whitaker were engaged. The engagement happened during a weekend trip to a vineyard outside Charlottesville. Isaiah had arranged a private dinner on the property's terrace, overlooking the hills, where he presented Savannah with a small velvet ring box beneath the fading light of sunset. Savannah said yes. The photograph of the proposal circulated quickly. Friends congratulated them enthusiastically. The story felt simple. A man who had endured a difficult marriage had found happiness again. Most people accepted that explanation without hesitation. Marina saw the announcement 2 days later. Again, she sat at her kitchen table looking at the image. Savannah's hand held forward slightly, the ring catching the light. Isaiah smiling beside her. For a long moment, Marina said nothing. Then she stood up and walked quietly to the small desk in the corner of her living room. Inside the desk drawer was the same black notebook she had kept for years. Beneath it sat a flash drive containing archived financial documents. Marina placed the engagement photograph beside her laptop and opened the folders she had not reviewed since the divorce had been finalized. Emails, bank statements, transfer records. For several minutes, she simply scrolled through the files, reacquainting herself with the patterns she had once studied so carefully. The numbers had not changed. The timelines still aligned. Marina closed the laptop slowly. She had not reopened the records because of jealousy, nor because she wanted to disrupt Isaiah's new life. But the engagement reminded her of something she had never fully resolved. The financial patterns from the final years of the marriage, the reimbursement transfers, the incomplete disclosures. At the time, she had chosen peace over investigation. Now, looking at the photograph of Isaiah and Savannah smiling beneath the vineyard sunset, a different thought settled quietly in her mind. Sometimes patterns remain unfinished, only until someone looks at them again with fresh distance. And Marina Caldwell had always been very good at reviewing old records. The night Marina Caldwell reopened the archive folder, she did not intend to begin an investigation. At least, that was what she told herself. The engagement announcement had stirred something quieter than anger, something closer to unfinished curiosity. The financial patterns she had noticed during the divorce had never fully resolved in her mind, but she had accepted Daniel Harper's advice at the time. Without stronger evidence, pursuing them legally would have meant prolonging a marriage that had already ended. Still, distance can change the way information appears. What once looked uncertain sometimes becomes clearer when viewed months later without emotional pressure. Marina sat at her desk beneath the soft light of a small lamp and opened the folder labeled Simply Archive. The files were arranged in careful order. Bank statements sorted by month. Downloaded transaction logs, copies of financial disclosure forms from the divorce settlement, email correspondence related to shared accounts. Marina began reading slowly. She had learned over the years that rushing through documents often meant missing small details, the kind that quietly connected larger patterns. At first, nothing seemed different. The reimbursement transfers still appeared exactly where she remembered them. Modest sums moving out of their joint account at irregular intervals. $300 here, $400 there, occasionally a slightly larger amount. Each transfer had been categorized in a way that suggested business expenses. Each had later been offset by other deposits that appeared unrelated. But as Marina reviewed the dates again, something else caught her attention. One particular transfer, $475, had occurred only 2 days before the meeting she and Isaiah had attended with their financial advisor during the final year of the marriage. She remembered that meeting clearly. Isaiah had presented their financial situation, confidently summarizing account balances and investment positions, with the ease of someone accustomed to negotiating large deals. At the time, Marina had assumed the numbers reflected the full picture. Now she noticed that the transfer had temporarily reduced the balance in their primary account just before those numbers were presented. 2 weeks later, a nearly identical amount appeared again from a different source. The pattern was subtle, but it repeated. Marina opened a spreadsheet and began marking each instance again, this time adding an additional column: context, financial meeting, tax filing, investment review. As the timeline expanded, the pattern gained structure. Transfers appeared most often shortly before moments when their financial position would be summarized or reviewed. Not always, but frequently enough to raise a question. Why would Isaiah move small amounts of money just before presenting financial summaries? It might have been coincidence, or ordinary business accounting. Still, Marina continued marking the dates. An hour passed quietly, then another. By midnight, the spreadsheet displayed something she had not fully seen before. The reimbursements were not random. They clustered around specific moments connected to financial visibility. Marina leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. The amounts were small enough that no single transaction would attract scrutiny. But over time, they accumulated into a much larger total. More importantly, the timing suggested intent. Still, suspicion alone meant very little. Daniel Harper had explained that clearly during the divorce. Without evidence showing where the money had gone or why it had been moved, the pattern remained speculative. Marina closed the spreadsheet and turned her attention to the email archive. There were hundreds of messages stored there, most of them routine communications about bills, insurance renewals, or tax documentation. She scanned them slowly. At first, the messages seemed unremarkable. Then, buried deep within a chain of forwarded correspondence, she noticed something unusual. The message dated back nearly 2 years. The subject line referenced a property development project Isaiah had once been involved in. The email itself had originally been sent to Isaiah by someone at his company's accounting department. It contained an attached document listing reimbursement requests for travel expenses connected to the project. Isaiah had forwarded the email to himself from his work account to a personal address. That was not unusual. People often forwarded documents between accounts. What caught Marina's attention was the attachment. The file name appeared ordinary project expenses _Q3.xlsx. But the metadata displayed something unexpected. The document had been modified several hours after the email had been sent. Marina downloaded the attachment and opened it. The spreadsheet contained rows of expense entries, hotel charges, mileage reimbursements, meeting costs. Most were small, routine. But one entry near the bottom appeared different. The amount listed there matched one of the transfers she had noticed earlier in the bank statements, $475. Marina stared at the number. The expense description read, "Client travel reimbursement." But the date attached to the entry did not align with any travel Isaiah had mentioned at the time. Marina scrolled further through the file. A few other entries looked similar, modest reimbursements categorized in ways that would easily blend into routine expense reports. She checked the bank statement again. 2 of those amounts appeared there as well. The implications were still uncertain. But the pattern had gained direction. Marina closed the document and leaned back in her chair, thinking carefully. It was nearly 1 in the morning. The townhouse around her had fallen completely silent. Outside, a faint streetlight cast long shadows across the living room floor. For a long moment, she did nothing. Then she opened her email and searched for a name she had not contacted in nearly a year. Rachel Kim. Rachel was a forensic accountant Daniel Harper had once mentioned during their earlier discussions. At the time, Marina had not pursued that option because she wanted the divorce to conclude quickly. Now the circumstances were different. Marina typed a short message. "Hello, Rachel. My name is Marina Caldwell. Daniel Harper suggested your name last year during a legal consultation. I'm reviewing some historical financial documents and noticed a pattern involving reimbursement transfers connected to project expenses. Nothing urgent, but I'd appreciate your professional perspective if you have time to look at a few records." She paused before sending it. The message felt simple, almost casual. But Marina understood something important about professional investigations. They often begin exactly this way, with a question that seems small. She clicked send. Then she closed the laptop and stood up from the desk. The clock on the wall read 1:17. Marina walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood for a moment near the window. Across the street, the quiet neighborhood remained undisturbed. Most people in Alexandria were asleep. Isaiah Caldwell was likely asleep as well. Perhaps besides Savannah Whitaker planning the future they had just begun building together. He believed his past had already been explained. His narrative had settled comfortably among friends and colleagues. Marina Caldwell had been unstable. The marriage had failed. Life had moved forward. But stories built on incomplete records sometimes contain weaknesses that only appear much later. And somewhere inside the archive folder on Marina's computer, A small email attachment had just shifted the direction of a pattern she had been quietly observing for years. What it would ultimately prove remained uncertain. But one thing was already clear. The story Isaiah had told the world might not be the only version waiting to be heard. Rachel Kim replied the next morning. Marina saw the email just after arriving at her office, while the building was still quiet and the coffee machines were beginning their first cycles of the day. The message was brief. "Good morning, Marina. Daniel mentioned you once. If you can send the files you're looking at, I'd be happy to review them and let you know whether anything stands out." Rachel Marina read the message twice before responding. She attached the spreadsheet she had created, along with the bank statements and the expense document from Isaiah's old project file. She did not add commentary beyond a short explanation of what she had noticed. Then she returned to work. For most of the day, Marina focused on the systems she was responsible for managing. Shipping schedules needed to be adjusted after a delay at a Baltimore port. A compliance audit required updated documentation for 2 regional partners. Her colleagues passed by her desk several times with routine questions. To them, Marina appeared exactly as she always did. Calm, precise, quietly efficient. No one around her knew that a separate set of documents was now traveling through the inbox of a forensic accountant across town. Rachel Kim did not respond again until late afternoon. When the second email arrived, Marina was finishing a report summary. She opened it carefully. "I had a chance to review the files you sent. The individual transfers are small, but the timing you noted is interesting. It may be nothing, but I'd want to see more complete financial records before drawing conclusions. If you're comfortable, we could schedule a short meeting." Marina leaned back in her chair, considering the words. Rachel had not claimed wrongdoing, but she had not dismissed the pattern either. Marina replied with a simple confirmation. They agreed to meet 2 days later at a small office Rachel maintained near DuPont Circle. The building was modern and quiet, with glass walls and minimalist furniture that suggested a place where numbers mattered more than decoration. Rachel Kim greeted Marina at the reception area with a firm handshake. She was younger than Marina had expected, perhaps mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she noticed details quickly. "Daniel spoke highly of you," Rachel said as they walked toward a conference room. "I'm not sure that's necessary," Marina replied. Rachel smiled slightly. "People who keep organized records are always necessary." They sat across from each other at a long table. Rachel opened the files Marina had sent on her laptop. "Let's start with the transfers," she said. She pointed to the spreadsheet Marina had created. "You're right about the clustering. These transactions often occur just before financial reporting moments." "That's what I noticed," Marina said. Rachel scrolled further. "Individually, they're too small to trigger any formal oversight," she continued. "But over time, they add up." How much? Rachel typed a quick calculation. "Across the documents, you sent roughly $12,000. Marina nodded slowly. "12,000 isn't enormous," Rachel said. "But it's also not nothing. Could it simply be expense reimbursements? It could." Rachel agreed. "But the question isn't just what the transfers are labeled. It's where the money ultimately ended up." Rachel turned the screen toward Marina. "Right now, we only see the money leaving your joint account. We don't see where it goes next." Marina understood immediately. "So the trail stops here." "Exactly." Rachel leaned back slightly. "If Isaiah transferred the funds into another account, perhaps a project account, personal account, or corporate ledger, we'd need those records to follow the movement." Marina folded her hands on the table. "Would that matter legally?" Rachel considered the question carefully. "If the funds were concealed during divorce disclosures, yes," she said. "But proving concealment requires showing that the transfers intentionally altered the financial picture presented at the time." Marina glanced at the spreadsheet again. "That's difficult. It can be." Rachel paused. "But not impossible." For the next hour, they examined the documents more closely. Rachel identified several additional details Marina had not noticed. Some of the reimbursement descriptions in the project expense document appeared generic phrases like client travel or consultation costs without supporting documentation. In legitimate expense reports, Rachel explained such entries were usually accompanied by receipts or travel itineraries. These are thin, she said, pointing at the entries. Thin how minimal verification. Rachel zoomed in on the metadata for the document. Also, the modification timestamp suggests this file was edited after the original email was sent. Marina remembered noticing that detail earlier. Could that mean the numbers were adjusted? It could mean many things, Rachel replied carefully. But it's enough to justify further review. Marina sat quietly while Rachel saved several notes. Then Rachel closed the laptop. I want to be clear about something she said. This isn't proof of fraud, I understand. But it is the kind of pattern forensic accountants sometimes see when someone is attempting to smooth financial statements before disclosures. Marina nodded slowly. And if that's the case, Rachel answered calmly, then the rest of the money trail will exist somewhere. The meeting ended without dramatic conclusions. Rachel requested additional documents, tax returns from the final years of the marriage, more detailed bank statements, and any business correspondence Marina might still have access to. Marina agreed to gather what she could. As she left the office building later that afternoon, the city outside moved through its usual rhythm traffic lights, changing pedestrians, crossing intersections, conversations drifting from outdoor cafes. Nothing about the world around her suggested that anything significant had begun. But inside Marina's mind, the situation had shifted. For the first time since the divorce, someone with professional expertise had looked at the same records she had studied and recognized the pattern as unusual. Not dramatic, but meaningful. That evening, Marina returned home and opened the archive folder again. She began searching for additional records Rachel had requested. Tax documents, email attachments, old backups from shared devices. Most of the files appeared exactly as she remembered them. But as she explored deeper into the folders, another category of data appeared, one she had not reviewed in months. A digital backup from an old phone. The device had once been connected to their shared home account during the final year of the marriage. Marina had saved the backup automatically when transferring files to a new phone after the divorce. At the time, she had not explored its contents. Now she opened the folder. Inside were hundreds of small files, photos, text message archives, voice memos, calendar recordings. Most of them appeared ordinary. Then one file caught her attention. It was labeled simply audio_0914.m4a. Marina hesitated for a moment. She did not remember recording anything on that date. Still, curiosity guided her hand. She clicked the file. The speaker on her laptop crackled softly. Then a familiar voice began speaking, Isaiah Caldwell. The tone was relaxed, confident, and completely unaware that it had ever been recorded. Marina froze in her chair, because within the first 30 seconds of that audio file, Isaiah said something that no divorce document, no financial spreadsheet, and no social narrative could ever fully explain away. And Marina understood immediately that this recording, this quiet, accidental piece of evidence buried in an old device backup, might become the most important record she had ever found. For several seconds after the audio file began playing, Marina Caldwell did not move. Isaiah's voice filled the quiet room with the easy confidence she had known for years. It was unmistakably his steady, conversational, relaxed, in the way people become when they believe no one else is listening. The recording was slightly muffled, as though captured from across a table or through the fabric of a jacket pocket. There was background noise as well, glass touching a surface, a low murmur of conversation somewhere farther away. Marina leaned closer to the laptop. Then Isaiah spoke again. You just have to manage the story early. The words were casual, not whispered, not defensive, simply explanatory. A second voice responded, though it was harder to identify, likely another man, perhaps someone from Isaiah's office. What do you mean by manage it? Isaiah chuckled softly. The narrative, he said. If a marriage ends badly, people want an explanation. If you leave that vacuum open, everyone fills it with their own version. Marina felt a slow tightening in her chest. She did not remember this conversation, the recording date. September 14th placed it nearly a year before the divorce had been finalized. Before they had even spoken openly about separating, the other voice spoke again. "So what do you do?" Isaiah answered without hesitation. "You guide it." A faint clink of ice against glass sounded through the speaker. "You introduce the idea that something's wrong early enough that it feels natural later." The other man laughed quietly. "That sounds strategic." "It is strategic," Isaiah replied. "You frame things in a way that makes sense to people." "How?" Another pause. Isaiah's voice lowered slightly, though not enough to suggest secrecy. "Concern works best. Concern." "Yeah." You say things like, "She's been under a lot of stress lately," or "She's having a hard time balancing things." Nothing dramatic. Just enough that if things eventually fall apart, people already understand why. Marina sat completely still. She realized now where the recording must have come from. During the final year of their marriage, she had occasionally used her phone to record meetings for work when reviewing complicated logistics procedures. One evening, she must have placed the phone in her coat pocket after work while a recording app was still active. If Isaiah had spoken with someone nearby that night, perhaps at a restaurant or bar after a business meeting, the phone might have captured the conversation unintentionally. On the recording, the other man spoke again. "So you're basically setting the stage." Isaiah laughed again. "Exactly." The confidence in his voice was unmistakable. "It's not about lying," he continued. "It's about controlling interpretation. How's that different people believe the explanation that arrives first?" A pause followed. Then Isaiah added something else. "And if she reacts emotionally later, that just confirms what people already think." Marina felt the room grow very quiet. The air seemed heavier somehow. For years, she had sensed something similar happening in subtle ways, the comments about stress, the concerned explanations offered to friends. But hearing the strategy described so plainly created a different kind of clarity. The recording continued. The second man asked another question. "What if she doesn't react?" Isaiah answered calmly. "Eventually, everyone reacts to something. And if she doesn't?" Another brief silence. Then Isaiah spoke again. "Well, then the story still works. People assume things behind the scenes." The conversation shifted after that. The two men began discussing a development project, permits, investors, construction timelines. The tone became entirely professional. After several minutes, the recording ended with the soft rustle of fabric, as though the phone had been moved. Marina sat at her desk, staring at the silent laptop screen. She did not feel shocked. Shock requires surprise. And in truth, much of what Isaiah had said aligned with patterns she had already observed during the marriage. Still, hearing the strategy explained in his own voice carried a weight that documentation alone could never produce. Emails could be interpreted. Financial transfers could be debated. But tone reveals intention. Isaiah had not sounded angry. He had not sounded defensive. He had sounded analytical, as though he were explaining a business tactic. Marina replayed the recording from the beginning. This time, she listened more carefully. Every detail mattered. The phrasing, the pauses, the certainty. When it finished again, she leaned back slowly in her chair. Outside the townhouse window, evening had settled over the quiet street. A car passed somewhere in the distance. Inside the room, only the faint hum of the refrigerator disturbed the silence. For several minutes, Marina did nothing. Then she opened a new folder inside the archive directory. She named it Audio Evidence. The phrase felt strangely formal, but accuracy required precision. She saved a copy of the recording inside the folder, along with the original file metadata showing the date it had been created. Then she opened her email again. Rachel Kim's address appeared at the top of the recent messages. Marina hesitated briefly. not because she doubted the importance of what she had just heard, but because she understood the consequences of introducing something like this into a legal context. The recording changed the nature of the situation. Financial patterns suggested possibility. A recorded admission suggested intent. Marina typed slowly. Rachel. While reviewing old device backups tonight, I discovered an audio recording from September 14th of the year before my divorce. It appears to capture a conversation involving Isaiah discussing how he planned to shape the narrative around our marriage if it ended. I'm attaching the file for your review. Please let me know if this has any relevance to the financial questions we discussed. She read the message twice. Then she attached the file and pressed send. The email left her outbox quietly. Marina closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the stillness of the room. Isaiah Caldwell had spent months, perhaps years, carefully guiding the story that followed their divorce. A story about concern, about instability, about a marriage that failed because one partner could not manage the pressures around her. Until now, that story had faced very little resistance, but somewhere inside an ordinary digital backup, a conversation Isaiah believed was private had survived, and the voice in that recording did not sound like a man worried about his wife. It sounded like a man explaining how to make sure other people believed she was the problem. The difference between those two versions of the truth might soon become impossible to ignore. Rachel Kim called the next morning. Marina had just sat down at her desk at work when her phone vibrated quietly beside her keyboard. The number was unfamiliar, but she recognized the area code immediately. She stepped into the small conference room at the end of the hallway before answering. Marina Caldwell. Marina, it's Rachel Kim. Rachel's tone sounded measured, not alarmed, not excited, just focused. I listened to the recording you sent. Marina closed the door behind her. I assumed you might. There was a brief pause on the line. It's significant, Rachel said. Marina leaned lightly against the edge of the table. Because of what he says about the narrative, yes, Rachel replied. But not only that, what else? Rachel took a moment before answering. When we look at financial irregularities alone, proving intent can be difficult. Transfers may have explanations. Accounting adjustments happen. Lawyers argue over interpretation. Marina nodded, even though Rachel couldn't see her. But when someone is recorded describing a strategy to shape how others interpret events, Rachel continued that context, changes how those financial movements are evaluated. The implication settled slowly. You mean motive? Exactly. Rachel's voice remained calm. The recording doesn't prove financial concealment by itself, but it demonstrates a mindset that's very comfortable managing perception. Marina remained silent for a moment. What happens next? She asked. That depends on how far you want to pursue this. Marina looked through the glass wall of the conference room at the office floor beyond. Her co-workers moved between desks, carrying folders speaking quietly about shipments and logistics schedules. Everything looked ordinary, calm. I didn't start this to pursue anything, she said finally. I understand, Rachel replied. But now that the information exists, ignoring it may not be the best option. Rachel suggested they meet again with Daniel Harper. Your attorney needs to evaluate both the recording and the financial trail together, she explained. Would this reopen the divorce? Possibly, Rachel said carefully. If there's evidence that financial disclosures were incomplete or manipulated. Marina exhaled slowly. I'll contact Daniel. They ended the call. For the rest of the morning, Marina attempted to focus on her work, but her mind kept returning to the recording. Not the legal implications, the tone, the calm, instructional way Isaiah had explained his strategy. It sounded so similar to the way he used to describe business negotiations. Measured, confident, certain that outcomes could be shaped through preparation. That afternoon, Marina emailed Daniel Harper and requested a meeting. He responded within an hour. They scheduled a consultation for the following evening. Daniel Harper listened to the recording twice. The three of them, Daniel, Marina, and Rachel Kim, sat around the conference table in Daniel's office, while Isaiah's voice filled the room through a small speaker. When the audio ended, Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said quietly. No one spoke immediately. Rachel broke the silence first. "The financial transfers we reviewed earlier appear clustered around disclosure events," she explained. "Nothing large enough to attract scrutiny individually, but collectively they show a pattern." Daniel nodded slowly. "And now we have context," Rachel added. Daniel tapped his pen against the legal pad in front of him. "This recording is interesting." "Interesting," Rachel repeated. In legal terms, Daniel clarified interesting means useful but complicated. Marina watched him carefully. "Complicated how the recording clearly captures Isaiah describing a strategy to frame the narrative of a failing marriage." "That's not illegal." "No," Daniel agreed. "But it demonstrates calculated intent regarding reputation management." He paused. "And when we combine that mindset with financial adjustments occurring before disclosure meetings, the overall picture becomes more concerning." Rachel leaned forward slightly. Would that justify reviewing the divorce disclosures again? Daniel considered the question carefully. If we can demonstrate that the financial picture presented during the divorce process was intentionally altered even slightly, that could justify reopening certain aspects of the settlement. Marina spoke for the first time since the recording ended. "What would that involve? Document review first," Daniel said. "Subpoenas if necessary. Potential forensic accounting analysis." Rachel nodded. "That's my area." Daniel looked at Marina. "But I want to be clear about something. Pursuing this path means entering a formal legal process again. It won't remain quiet forever." Marina understood what he meant. Isaiah's reputation had remained largely intact since the divorce. Investigating the financial disclosures and potentially presenting the recording would inevitably disturb that stability. Not through confrontation, through procedure. "What are the chances it leads anywhere?" Marina asked. Daniel hesitated. "Moderate," he said. "Not guaranteed, but real." The room fell quiet again. Marina looked down at the printed spreadsheet Rachel had placed on the table earlier. Rows of numbers filled the page, dates, transfers, annotations. Small details. Details Isaiah had likely assumed no one would examine closely. Finally, Marina looked up. "I don't want revenge," she said. Daniel met her eyes. "I believe you, but I also don't want the official record of our marriage to be inaccurate." Rachel watched her carefully. "That's reasonable." Daniel nodded. "Then the next step is simple," he said. "We begin asking questions." Across the city, Isaiah Caldwell had no idea those questions had begun forming. His attention remained focused on something far more immediate. Wedding plans. Savannah Whitaker had always approached life with calm efficiency, but organizing a large wedding still required dozens of decisions. Venues, caterers, guest lists, flower arrangements. Isaiah attended most of the meetings with polite enthusiasm, though his schedule often pulled him away for work. One evening, they sat together at Savannah's kitchen table, reviewing invitations. Savannah held up one of the printed cards. "I think this design works," she said. Isaiah glanced at it briefly. "It's perfect." Savannah studied him for a moment. "You seem distracted tonight. Just work," Isaiah replied. She smiled sympathetically. "You've been dealing with a lot lately." Isaiah nodded. "Yes." Savannah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm glad things are calmer now." Isaiah smiled. "So am I." He believed that statement completely. The divorce had ended cleanly. His explanation of the marriage had settled comfortably among friends. The new life he was building with Savannah felt stable, predictable. He had carefully managed the story of his past. What he did not yet realize was that somewhere across the city, 3 people were now examining the details of that story. And sometimes, the smallest details numbers on a spreadsheet. A sentence spoken casually in a quiet restaurant can change the direction of a narrative more effectively than any argument ever could. The first questions reached Isaiah Caldwell quietly. No dramatic letters, no accusations, just a request. Daniel Harper sent the document 3 days after meeting with Marina and Rachel Kim. It was formally written, professionally worded, and narrow in scope. A request for clarification regarding several financial transfers made during the final year of the Caldwell marriage. From a legal perspective, the message looked routine. From Isaiah's perspective, it was unexpected. He opened the email late on a Thursday afternoon while sitting at his desk in the glass-walled office of the development firm where he worked in. Outside his window, cranes hovered over the skeleton of a half-finished office building, a project he had been negotiating for nearly a year. For several seconds, he simply read the message. Then he read it again. The language remained polite. But the timing was strange. The divorce had been finalized months earlier. Financial disclosures had already been signed and accepted by both parties. Why would Marina's attorney be revisiting those documents now? Isaiah leaned back in his chair. His first instinct was irritation. Not fear, just annoyance. Legal matters were supposed to end when settlements were signed. Reopening them suggested unnecessary complication. Still, the questions themselves appeared minor. Daniel Harper had highlighted several reimbursement transfers and requested additional documentation confirming their purpose. Isaiah frowned slightly. Those transfers had been business reimbursements connected to development travel expenses, at least that was how they had been categorized. He forwarded the email to his company's accounting department with a short message. "Can you confirm documentation for these reimbursements? Looks like my ex-wife's attorney wants clarification." Within an hour, someone from accounting replied, "We'll review the project expense records and send whatever documentation we have." Isaiah closed the email and returned to work. The matter felt inconvenient but manageable. There was no reason to believe it would go further. Savannah Whitaker noticed the change in his mood that evening. They were sitting together in the living room of her townhouse, reviewing a draft of the wedding guest list, when Isaiah checked his phone again. "You've looked at that email 3 times, Savannah said gently. Isaiah glanced up. "Just work stuff. Something serious, no." He set the phone down. "Just a question from my previous divorce paperwork. Nothing important," Savannah nodded. The explanation sounded reasonable. Still, she studied him for a moment. "You know," she said carefully, "you don't have to handle everything alone." Isaiah smiled. "I'm not." "Good." Savannah leaned back on the couch. Divorces can leave loose ends sometimes. Isaiah shrugged lightly. Lawyers love paperwork. She laughed softly. "That's true." The conversation moved on to other topics: venue decorations, seating arrangements, travel plans for Savannah's relatives coming from North Carolina. But Isaiah's mind remained partially elsewhere. The legal request itself did not worry him. What unsettled him slightly was the timing. Marina had shown little interest in revisiting the divorce once it was finalized. She had accepted the settlement quietly. So why now? Isaiah dismissed the thought quickly. Perhaps her attorney simply wanted to close some documentation loop. It happened. Lawyers often revisited files long after clients had moved on. Meanwhile, the same questions were reaching another household. Savannah's father, Robert Whitaker, had built a long career in infrastructure consulting. His work often required reviewing contracts, budgets, and municipal agreements with careful attention to detail. So when Savannah mentioned casually that Isaiah's ex-wife's attorney had contacted him about financial transfers, Robert's curiosity sharpened immediately. He did not suspect wrongdoing, but he had learned long ago that unusual questions rarely appeared without reason. A few days later, while Savannah and Isaiah were out meeting a caterer, Robert sat in his home office reviewing public records related to Isaiah's development projects. The research began casually. A few searches through property filings, a review of corporate partnership records. Everything appeared normal. Isaiah's firm had participated in several mid-sized development projects throughout the region. The financial structures looked typical. Still, Robert noticed something interesting. One of the project companies listed as a reimbursement source in a financial filing had been dissolved only months after the Caldwell divorce. Again, that detail did not necessarily indicate anything unusual. Development companies frequently created temporary entities for specific projects. but Robert wrote the name down anyway. 2 days later, Rachel Kim contacted Marina again. "I've been reviewing the additional bank records you sent," she said. Marina listened quietly from her living room. "And the transfers appear to connect to project expense accounts," Rachel said. "But the accounting trail is inconsistent." Inconsistent, how Rachel explained. Several reimbursement payments came from project entities that closed soon afterward. That doesn't necessarily mean anything improper, but it complicates the documentation. Marina understood. If the entities no longer exist, the paper trail becomes harder to verify. Exactly. Rachel paused. However, the pattern still suggests that funds were temporarily moved before financial summaries were presented, which means the disclosures may not have reflected the full picture. That's our working theory. Marina glanced at the small notebook she still kept near her desk. Years earlier, she had written down moments that felt unusual without fully understanding why. Now those quiet observations were aligning with professional analysis. "What happens next?" she asked. "Daniel is preparing a formal request for additional documentation," Rachel replied. "If the records confirm what we suspect, he may petition the court to review the settlement." Marina nodded slowly, and the recording Rachel's tone shifted slightly. "That will matter later." "How?" "Because it shows intent to control perception." Marina said nothing. "Financial disputes can become technical arguments," Rachel continued. "But when a recording reveals that someone deliberately shaped how others would interpret events, judges tend to listen more carefully." The conversation ended soon after. Marina closed the phone and sat quietly for several minutes. Across the room, her laptop remained open to the same archive folder she had been reviewing for weeks. Numbers, emails, documents, and now a recording. Each piece by itself might have meant little. Together they formed a story Isaiah had never intended anyone to assemble. That same evening, Isaiah received a second email from Daniel Harper. This one was longer, more specific. Additional financial records requested. Documentation related to several project reimbursements. Verification of the source accounts. Isaiah frowned as he read it. This was no longer a simple clarification. It was beginning to look like an investigation. He forwarded the email again to accounting. But this time, his message was shorter. "Need these records quickly." For the first time since receiving the initial request, Isaiah felt a faint sense of irritation sharpen into something else. Not fear. Not yet. But something close to unease. Because questions, once they begin, have a tendency to multiply. And somewhere beyond his immediate view, the quiet narrative he had spent years managing was beginning to encounter something far less cooperative than social sympathy. Documentation. The week of the wedding arrived with the kind of excitement that fills a household long before the ceremony itself. Savannah Whitaker's townhouse had gradually transformed into a small headquarters of celebration. Boxes of decorations lined the hallway. Garment bags hung from the guest room door frames. A large white binder labeled "Wedding Plans" sat permanently open on the dining table. Family members moved in and out of the house with cheerful urgency. Savannah's mother coordinated seating arrangements. Her younger cousin managed transportation schedules for relatives flying in from North Carolina. Robert Whitaker, though less involved in the decorative details, handled practical logistics with quiet efficiency: hotel bookings, shuttle reservations, final vendor confirmations. To anyone visiting the house that week, the atmosphere would have appeared warm and hopeful. But beneath the surface, something else had begun to shift. Savannah noticed it first. Isaiah Caldwell had always been composed. One of the qualities that attracted her to him in the beginning was his calm presence in situations that made others anxious. Yet, during the days leading up to the wedding, that calm seemed thinner. He checked his phone more often. He stepped away to take calls in the hallway. Several times, he paused mid-conversation as though trying to remember something he had just been thinking about. Savannah did not confront him immediately. Weddings created stress for anyone, but the changes were noticeable. One evening, 2 days before the rehearsal dinner, they sat together on the back patio of her townhouse. reviewing the final vendor confirmations. Savannah watched him read through a catering contract. "You're distracted again," she said gently. Isaiah glanced up. "Sorry, just work. Work again. It's the development project in Bethesda. Some paperwork questions." Savannah nodded slowly. She had heard about the project many times over the past few months. It sounded complicated. Still, something about his tone felt rehearsed. "Is it serious?" she asked. "No," Isaiah replied quickly. "Just lawyers doing lawyer things." Savannah smiled faintly. Lawyers do enjoy that. Isaiah returned his attention to the contract. But Savannah continued watching him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then she said something else. "Your ex-wife's lawyer contacted you again, didn't he?" Isaiah looked up sharply. Why would you think that Savannah shrugged lightly? "You mentioned it last week." "That was nothing. And now you're getting more legal emails." Isaiah exhaled slowly. "It's just documentation requests. For the divorce, yes." Savannah tilted her head slightly. "I thought the divorce was finalized months ago." "It was. So why are they still asking questions?" Isaiah hesitated, only for a moment. But Savannah noticed. "Probably just closing paperwork," he said. His tone remained calm, but the explanation felt incomplete. Savannah did not push further. Instead, she reached across the patio table and squeezed his hand. "Whatever it is, it'll work out." Isaiah nodded. "Of course." But after she went inside that evening, Isaiah remained sitting alone on the patio for a long time. He opened his phone and reread Daniel Harper's latest email. The language had grown more precise. Requests for documentation had expanded into questions about specific project accounts. Rachel Kim's name appeared in the CC line. Isaiah searched the name online. Forensic accountant. He frowned. That seemed excessive. The reimbursement transfers had legitimate explanations. At least they should have. Still, he typed a quick message to his company's accounting manager. "Need confirmation on those reimbursement records, ASAP. My ex-wife's attorney brought in a forensic accountant." The reply came half an hour later. "Still reviewing older project files. Some entities closed after development phases. Might take a day or two to pull everything." Isaiah stared at the message. A day or two. The rehearsal dinner was tomorrow. The wedding itself would take place the following afternoon. The timing felt inconvenient, but it was unlikely anything serious would emerge that quickly. He put the phone away and went inside. Across the city, Marina Caldwell spent that same evening in a very different environment. Her townhouse remained quiet. No decorations, no guests, just the familiar calm she had grown comfortable with. Rachel Kim had sent another update earlier that afternoon. Additional financial records were still incomplete, but the pattern remained consistent. Transfers clustered around financial reporting dates, project entities that opened and closed quickly, expense categories that lacked supporting documentation. Daniel Harper had already prepared a preliminary motion requesting judicial review of the divorce disclosures. Nothing had been filed yet, but the process was moving forward. Marina sat at her desk, reading through Rachel's summary notes. The information no longer felt abstract. Each new document added another small piece to the picture. Yet Marina herself remained emotionally distant from the investigation. She did not imagine courtroom confrontations. She did not picture Isaiah's reaction. Her focus remained narrower. Accuracy. For years, she had watched the story of her marriage shift quietly in conversations she was no longer part of. Now the official record might begin shifting as well. That was enough. Her phone vibrated softly on the desk. A message from Rachel. One more update. The project entity linked to several reimbursements appears to have closed 2 months after the divorce. That timing may matter. Marina read the message carefully. Then she responded with a short acknowledgement. The night outside had grown still. Somewhere far away, wedding preparations continued, rehearsal schedules, family dinners, laughter among guests who believed they were gathering for a joyful celebration. Marina closed her laptop. For the first time since finding the recording, she allowed herself to think briefly about Savannah Whitaker. Savannah had done nothing wrong. She had simply stepped into a life that Isaiah had carefully presented, the same way many others had. Marina stood and walked to the kitchen window. The quiet street outside remained unchanged. Streetlights glowed softly against the pavement. In less than 48 hours, Isaiah Caldwell would be standing at an altar again, surrounded by people who believed they understood the story of his past. What none of them knew, what even Isaiah himself had not yet fully realized, was that the narrative he had built so carefully was now moving toward a moment where documentation, financial records, and one accidental recording might intersect. And when those pieces finally aligned, the setting where that story collapsed would be far more public than the quiet townhouse where Marina Caldwell had first begun writing things down. The morning of the rehearsal dinner began quietly. Savannah Whitaker woke early, long before the rest of the house. For several minutes, she remained lying still, staring at the ceiling while the first pale light of morning spread across the bedroom walls. Weddings have a way of making time feel strange. Every hour becomes significant, every small task connected to a larger moment that people will remember for years. Savannah had spent months planning this day, yet now that it had arrived, the excitement felt mixed with something more complicated. Not fear, just a lingering sense that something in Isaiah's world had not fully settled. She pushed the thought aside and got out of bed. Downstairs, the kitchen already smelled faintly of coffee. Her father, Robert Whitaker, stood at the counter reading emails on his tablet while the coffee maker hummed beside him. "Morning," Savannah said. Robert glanced up. "Morning." She poured herself a cup and sat at the table. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." Robert smiled slightly. Old habits. They sat in silence for a moment. Savannah studied her father carefully. Robert had always been someone who noticed details others missed. During her childhood, he could glance at a contract or a budget sheet and immediately find the line that mattered. That attention to detail had built his career. And occasionally, it made him unusually quiet. "Something on your mind?" Savannah asked. Robert hesitated. "Possibly." She raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." "It's probably nothing he said." Savannah leaned forward. "Dad." Robert placed the tablet on the table. "You mentioned earlier this week that Isaiah's ex-wife's attorney contacted him again." Savannah nodded. "Just paperwork." "That's what Isaiah said, yes." Robert folded his hands. "I spent some time looking into a few of the project entities connected to his development work." Savannah blinked. "You investigated my fiancé." "I looked at public records," Robert corrected gently. "And some of the companies tied to reimbursement payments closed shortly after the divorce." Savannah frowned slightly. "That doesn't sound unusual." "It may not be," Robert said. "But the timing caught my attention." Savannah watched him carefully. Why Robert hesitated again. "Because yesterday evening, I received a phone call. From who? A man named Daniel Harper." Savannah's eyebrows lifted. "Isaiah's ex-wife's attorney." "Yes." The kitchen grew very quiet. Savannah slowly set her coffee cup down. "What did he want?" Robert chose his words carefully. "He asked if I would be willing to listen to something before the wedding." Savannah felt a slow tightening in her chest. Listen to what Robert looked at her steadily. A recording. They listened to it together in Robert's home office. The small room was lined with bookshelves and framed photographs from decades of work projects. Outside the window, the quiet suburban street remained still in the early morning light. Robert placed his tablet on the desk and pressed play. Isaiah's voice filled the room. "You just have to manage the story early." Savannah froze. At first, she assumed it must be some kind of misunderstanding. Perhaps a business conversation taken out of context. But as the recording continued, the explanation became impossible to ignore. You introduce the idea that something's wrong early enough that it feels natural later. Concern works best. People believe the explanation that arrives first. Savannah felt the air around her grow heavy. The tone of Isaiah's voice was calm, analytical, almost instructional. He sounded exactly the way he did when explaining business negotiations. But the subject of the conversation was different. He was explaining how to shape people's perception of a failing marriage. Savannah looked slowly toward her father. Robert did not speak. The recording continued. If she reacts emotionally later, that just confirms what people already think. When the audio ended, Robert closed the tablet. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Savannah whispered, "Is that real?" "Yes." "How do you know?" "Because Daniel Harper confirmed the recording came from Marina Caldwell's device backup." Savannah swallowed slowly. "So Isaiah knew this could exist?" "No," Robert said. "From what I understand, it was recorded accidentally." Savannah stood up and walked to the window. Her mind replayed dozens of conversations she had had with Isaiah over the past year. The careful concern he expressed when describing his previous marriage. The way friends had accepted his explanation without question. The sympathy people offered him. Now those memories felt different. Not false, but constructed. Behind her, Robert spoke quietly. "I'm not telling you what to do." Savannah nodded. "I know. But I felt you deserved to hear this before the wedding." Savannah closed her eyes for a moment. "Does Isaiah know you heard it?" "No." "Does he know the recording exists?" "I believe his attorney does not yet know about it either," Robert said carefully. Savannah turned around slowly. "What about the financial questions?" Robert gestured toward the tablet. The same attorney believes some financial disclosures during the divorce may have been incomplete. Savannah felt a cold wave of realization. "So the recording shows how he shaped the story about Marina?" "Yes. And the financial investigation suggests he may have shaped the paperwork too." Robert did not answer immediately, but his silence said enough. Savannah walked back toward the desk and looked down at the tablet again. Isaiah's voice still echoed faintly in her memory. Confident, certain, controlled. Finally, she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the recording ended. "When did Daniel send this to you this morning?" Savannah glanced at the clock on the wall. The rehearsal dinner would begin in just a few hours. Family members would gather. Friends would toast the future. Isaiah would arrive, smiling, confident that everything in his life was exactly where he had arranged it to be. Savannah sat down slowly in the chair beside the desk. "Dad." "Yes, if what he said in that recording is true." Robert waited. "Then everything he told me about Marina might have been part of the strategy." Robert did not interrupt. Savannah stared at the dark screen of the tablet. Then she said quietly, "I need to speak with Isaiah." And somewhere across the city, completely unaware that the calm story he had spent years constructing was beginning to fracture, Isaiah Caldwell was preparing for the rehearsal dinner that he still believed would lead to a perfect wedding the next day. By late afternoon, the rehearsal dinner venue had begun filling with quiet anticipation. The restaurant sat along the waterfront in Old Town Alexandria, a carefully restored brick building overlooking the river. Inside, long tables had been arranged with white linens and soft candlelight. Through the tall windows, the fading sunlight cast golden reflections across the water. Guests arrived in small groups. Savannah's cousins laughed near the entrance while greeting relatives who had flown in that morning. A few of Isaiah's colleagues stood near the bar discussing real estate projects, their voices relaxed and casual. Everything appeared exactly the way a rehearsal dinner should look. Comfortable, celebratory, certain. Isaiah Caldwell arrived a few minutes after 6. He stepped through the entrance with his usual composed confidence, greeting people with easy familiarity. His suit jacket rested perfectly across his shoulders, and his smile appeared effortless. If he felt any tension from the legal emails earlier in the week, he showed none of it. To the guests gathered inside the restaurant, Isaiah looked like a man standing at the beginning of a joyful new chapter. Savannah, however, watched him differently. She had arrived nearly half an hour earlier with her parents. During that time, she had spoken politely with guests, accepted hugs from relatives, and responded to congratulations with practiced warmth. but her attention remained fixed on the door, waiting. When Isaiah finally entered, their eyes met across the room. For a moment he smiled the way he always did when he saw her. But Savannah did not immediately return the smile. Isaiah noticed. He walked toward her slowly, weaving through the tables until he reached the small corner where she stood beside her father. "Hey," he said softly. Savannah nodded. "Hi." Isaiah leaned in slightly as though expecting a quick kiss. Savannah stepped back just enough that the gesture paused awkwardly in the air. The movement was small, but noticeable. Isaiah's expression changed slightly. "Everything okay?" he asked. Savannah glanced briefly at her father. Robert Whitaker remained calm, his posture steady and observant. Then Savannah looked back at Isaiah. "We need to talk." Isaiah glanced around the room. Guests continued arriving. Glasses clinked near the bar. "This might not be the best moment," he said carefully. "It needs to be now." Her voice was quiet, but firm. Isaiah hesitated. Then he nodded. "Okay." Robert gestured toward a smaller private room near the back of the restaurant. "I think that room is available," he said. The three of them walked together through a short hallway until they reached the door. Inside, the room was empty. A small table sat near the center, surrounded by several chairs. Soft light from a wall lamp illuminated the space. Robert closed the door behind them. Isaiah turned toward Savannah. "What's going on?" Savannah did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at her father. Robert placed his tablet on the table and pressed the screen once. The recording began playing. Isaiah's voice filled the room. "You just have to manage the story early." For the first 2 seconds, Isaiah did not react. Then, recognition flashed across his face. His eyes moved quickly toward the tablet. Savannah watched him carefully. The recording continued. "You introduce the idea that something's wrong early enough that it feels natural later." Isaiah stepped forward abruptly. "Turn that off." Robert did not move. "Concern works best." Isaiah reached toward the tablet, but Robert calmly lifted it out of reach. "Let it finish," Robert said. Isaiah's jaw tightened. People believe the explanation that arrives first. Savannah stood perfectly still as the final sentences played. If she reacts emotionally later, that just confirms what people already think. The recording ended. Silence filled the room. Isaiah exhaled sharply. "Where did you get that?" Robert answered calmly. "From Marina Caldwell's attorney." Isaiah laughed once, though the sound lacked humor. "Of course." He turned toward Savannah. "This isn't what it looks like." Savannah's voice remained steady. "Then explain it." Isaiah ran a hand through his hair. The conversation was taken out of context. "How I was talking about public perception in general," he said quickly. "It was a hypothetical discussion about how people interpret relationships." Savannah did not interrupt. Isaiah continued. "You know how people gossip. Once rumors start, it's impossible to control the narrative." "So you decided to control it first?" Savannah asked quietly. Isaiah hesitated. "That's not what I meant." Robert spoke for the first time since the recording ended. "Then what did you mean when you said concern works best?" Isaiah's eyes shifted toward him. "You're misinterpreting it." Robert remained calm. "I've spent 40 years reviewing contracts and negotiations. Tone matters." Isaiah looked back at Savannah. "You believe this?" Savannah's answer came slowly. "I'm trying to understand it." Isaiah gestured toward the tablet. "That recording doesn't prove anything about my marriage." "No," Savannah said, "but it shows how you talked about it." Isaiah opened his mouth to respond. Then he stopped. For the first time since entering the room, he seemed unsure. Savannah continued speaking. "And there's something else." Isaiah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, my father spoke with Marina's attorney." Isaiah felt a flicker of unease. "He mentioned financial questions from the divorce." Isaiah crossed his arms. "That's just paperwork." Savannah held his gaze. "Then why is a forensic accountant involved?" Isaiah's expression hardened. That's ridiculous, Robert answered calmly. They're reviewing reimbursement transfers tied to several project entities. Isaiah turned toward him. You have no idea how development accounting works. That may be true, Robert said, but forensic accountants usually do. The silence that followed stretched longer than any of the previous pauses. Outside the door, laughter from the dining room drifted faintly into the hallway. Guests continued arriving for a rehearsal dinner that had not yet officially begun. Inside the small private room, Isaiah Caldwell realized something he had not expected. For the first time in years, the story he had carefully arranged about his past was no longer being accepted automatically. Savannah spoke again. Isaiah. Her voice carried neither anger nor accusation. Just clarity. I can't marry someone whose past I don't understand. Isaiah stared at her. You're letting my ex-wife manipulate you. Savannah shook her head slowly. No. She pointed gently toward the tablet. You did that yourself. Isaiah said nothing. For several seconds, he simply stood there, the weight of the recording lingering in the quiet room. Outside, the restaurant lights glowed warmly against the river. Inside the future he had spent months planning was beginning to slip quietly out of alignment. And the rehearsal dinner guests, waiting beyond the door, had no idea that the wedding they had traveled to celebrate was now standing on a very fragile foundation. For several long seconds after Savannah Whitaker finished speaking, no one in the room moved. Isaiah Caldwell stood near the table, his hands resting stiffly against the back of a chair. The calm confidence that usually defined him had thinned into something less stable, something that looked very much like calculation, struggling to find new ground. Savannah watched him carefully, not with anger, not with humiliation, just observation. Isaiah finally broke the silence. This is a mistake, he said quietly. Savannah tilted her head slightly. Which part? The part where you're believing a recording and some legal paperwork over the person you're about to marry. Savannah absorbed the words without reacting immediately. You're right about one thing, she said after a moment. Isaiah waited. This is about trust. He nodded quickly. Exactly. But trust doesn't disappear all at once. Savannah continued. It fades when explanations stop making sense. Isaiah's jaw tightened. You're letting my ex-wife control the story again. Savannah looked down briefly at the tablet resting on the table. That recording wasn't her voice. Isaiah opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. Robert Whitaker spoke calmly from beside the door. No one here is accusing you of anything yet. Isaiah turned sharply toward him. Yet Robert's expression remained steady. But financial questions have been raised, he continued, and the recording suggests you were comfortable shaping narratives when it benefited you. Isaiah laughed once, though it sounded strained. Every professional understands narrative. Robert nodded slightly. That may be true, but most people don't rehearse how to frame their spouse as unstable before a divorce. Savannah closed her eyes briefly. The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Isaiah shifted his weight, clearly aware that the conversation had reached a point he could no longer easily redirect. Look, he said, finally turning back towards Savannah. Marina and I had a complicated marriage. Things were messy. People talk. I tried to manage how that looked publicly. That's not what the recording sounded like, Savannah replied softly. Isaiah rubbed his forehead. You're blowing this out of proportion. Savannah did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the tablet and tapped the screen again. Isaiah's voice played once more. You just have to manage the story early. Savannah stopped the recording before the rest continued. She looked up at him. Do you hear the difference, she asked. Isaiah stared at her. In that recording, you're not reacting to a messy marriage. She paused. You're planning one. Isaiah's shoulders stiffened. That's not fair. Savannah's voice remained calm. No, it's not fair. She stood slowly from the chair. which is exactly why I need time to understand it. Isaiah's expression darkened. The wedding is tomorrow, I know. Guests continued laughing faintly in the dining room beyond the wall. Someone began clinking a glass, probably signaling that dinner would begin soon. Savannah looked toward the door briefly, then back at Isaiah. I can't stand in front of everyone tomorrow and promise a lifetime to someone whose past I'm still discovering. Isaiah stared at her in disbelief. You're canceling the wedding because of a conversation taken out of context? Savannah's answer was gentle but firm. No, she paused. I'm postponing the wedding because I need the full context. The difference between those two words hung heavily in the room. Isaiah looked from Savannah to Robert Whitaker. This is ridiculous. Robert opened the door quietly. Voices from the dining room spilled into the hallway. People are waiting, he said. Savannah nodded. We should go explain. Isaiah did not move. You're serious? Savannah met his eyes one last time. Yes. And with that, she stepped into the hallway beside her father. Isaiah remained alone in the small private room for several seconds after they left. The recording still lingered faintly in his mind. The calm explanation he had once given to a colleague about shaping narratives. The strategy that had seemed harmless at the time. He had believed it would remain part of a quiet conversation no one else would ever hear. Now it had reached the one place he had never expected it to surface, the moment before a second marriage. Across the restaurant, conversations slowly quieted as Savannah stepped into the dining room. Guests turned toward her with warm smiles, expecting the usual informal welcome that begins a rehearsal dinner. Savannah stood near the center of the room, her father beside her. For a moment, she simply looked at the people gathered there. Family, friends, colleagues who had traveled to celebrate something they believed was certain. Then she spoke. I'm sorry to interrupt everyone. The room fell silent. Savannah continued calmly. There's been a development involving some unresolved matters from Isaiah's previous marriage. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Savannah's voice remained steady. Because of that, we've decided to postpone the wedding until those matters are fully understood. A ripple of quiet surprise moved through the room, but Savannah did not elaborate further. She simply thanked the guests for coming and apologized for the unexpected change of plans. Behind her, Isaiah finally emerged from the hallway. His face had regained much of its composure, but the atmosphere around him had shifted. Questions, silent ones, now lingered in the eyes of the people who had once accepted his story without hesitation. And once questions begin, they rarely disappear quietly. Several weeks later, Marina Caldwell received a brief email from Daniel Harper. The subject line read, Settlement Review Approved. A judge had agreed to examine the financial disclosures from the Caldwell divorce. The investigation would continue. Marina read the message once. Then she closed her laptop. Outside her townhouse window, the late afternoon sun rested softly across the quiet street. The process ahead might take months, possibly longer. But Marina felt no urgency. For years, she had lived quietly with a story she knew was incomplete. Now the truth had begun moving through official channels, documents, recordings, financial records. Not through arguments, not through revenge, through procedure. And that was enough. Marina stood turned off the light in her office and walked toward the door. When she stepped outside, she carried nothing with her except the quiet certainty that sometimes dignity does not come from winning a fight. Sometimes it comes from allowing the truth to take its time. Some stories don't end with shouting revenge or dramatic victories. Sometimes they end with a quiet shift when the truth simply becomes visible. Marina Caldwell never tried to argue with Isaiah's version of events. She didn't fight in public. She didn't attempt to embarrass him or reclaim sympathy. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She observed. She kept records. She waited. And when the time came, the facts spoke for themselves through bank records, through legal procedures, and through one accidental recording that revealed more than Isaiah ever intended. In the end, No one needed to attack him. His own words did the work. Savannah didn't respond with anger either. She didn't humiliate Isaiah in front of their guests. She simply chose clarity over certainty and honesty over comfort. Sometimes the strongest decision is simply stepping back until the full story becomes clear. And sometimes the most lasting form of justice isn't revenge. It's walking away with your dignity intact, while the truth quietly takes its place. If this story resonated with you, if you believe truth eventually finds its way into the light, take a moment to share your thoughts. Where in the world are you watching from today? And what time is it in your city right now? It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, difficult truths, and the long road to justice, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. Thank you for staying with the story until the end.